Welcome back to our panel discussion, Advanced Cyber Monitoring, sponsored by RSA and Optiv here on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM. My guests today are Peter Schauwacker, Director of Security Intelligence Solutions at Optiv. Peter Tran is General Manager and Senior Director for Worldwide Advanced Cyber Defense Practice at RSA. Dr. Barry West is Senior Advisor and Senior Accountable Official for Risk Management at the Homeland Security Department. Chad Sheridan is the Chief Information Officer at the Agriculture Department's Risk Management Agency, and Lawrence Reed, Assistant Director for Security Operations at the Justice Department. And I think in this next part we want to talk about something that has really come on in a big way for federal agencies, and that is the hybrid IT environment. And there are still 5,000 or so data centers of varying sizes operated by the federal government. That's after data center consolidation. So maybe there's another 4,000 to go. But federal data centers, federal networks owned, operated by agencies will be with us for a long time. At the same time, there's a giant market in federal cloud computing that's developed. And so most agencies really acknowledge that the hybrid environment is kind of what the model will be for the continue as far as we can see into the future. And so with that, you've got your own applications on your own servers, and you've got instantiations in virtual mode of some applications, some of them the same ones, some totally in the cloud, and they're all over the place. And so you have service level agreements that have to come into your cybersecurity monitoring regime, if you will. So I want to pull on that one first, the hybrid environment and how you are dealing with it. Barry, I think Homeland Security is a great one to start with there too.
It is, and I couldn't agree with you more as far as the future with the hybrid approach. I think there's still always going to be cases for the private cloud and the public cloud, but I think the hybrid is the best of both worlds because you're really getting to leverage a vendor maybe for processing power or storage or disaster recovery, but you're also getting your local applications, some which may be very archaic and old legacy, that you can actually still have in-house. So you give that sense of comfort to your customers as well, that everything is not just in the cloud. Although I'd argue that in a lot of cases it's more secure in the cloud. What we're doing at DHS, we actually use a defense in depth model for all of our security. So where we're looking at policies, procedures, and awareness, physical security, the perimeter, the network, the host, the apps, and the data. And we do that whether it's on-premise or we're working with an Amazon and we're looking at their SOC guidance, Sarbanes-Oxley, and so on. But what we do is we use a cloud security architecture guidance using virtual machines within the application boundary, dedicated to collecting application and security logs for monitoring purposes.
Now, do you collect that, or does
yes,
the cloud provider do that?
We actually collect that. In addition, for allowing for a central point of data aggregation, this particular architecture allows you to selectively forward specific event types to your monitoring team, and also reducing the amount of bandwidth and license consumption, in addition to enhancing the efficiency of the analyst that's actually using the data. If needed for further investigation, depending on the event, these are still available for the analyst to pull from the cloud if, in fact, we decide to have backup or something goes down. So we'd be covered in any case.
Okay, so does that fit that whole need for velocity and currency in what it is that's monitored?
Yes.
Okay, how about justice? There's a lot of cloud activity there too.
There is. We're pushing hard to move a lot of stuff to the cloud. Some of the challenges we've run into that, like Barry said, you got to keep a defense in depth approach on that. But as you get, so when you lift and shift an on-prem application to the cloud, it's pretty simple to keep your security with it from the operating perspective.
Works that simply, though,
it never does, no, but we like to think about it that way. But as you re-engineer the applications to be more cloud aware or cloud native, that's when you get some opportunities to instrument them a little bit more completely and accurately for that. Getting data.
It's almost like self-cyber knowledge that can be coded into the application.
So when you create your AMI or your image in the cloud and you put your security right in that, now every time one's spun up, it has it from the beginning. It takes a little bit of rigor and process to make that happen. But that's one of the places where you can then build the security into the cloud environment from the beginning. Getting data from the cloud service providers themselves in terms of what's going on in your environment is a bit of a challenge as well. So who's using your API keys, where are they coming from, are they doing things they're authorized to do, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of complexity to that as you make that migration.
And can those be expressed in service level agreements, those complexities?
Some of them can. It depends on the cloud service you're getting. If it's infrastructure or platform as a service, depends on the complexity you get into there. You do have to understand what the shared security model gives you from the cloud service providers as you're doing that, so that you can understand the whole picture.
So in a sense, their outer security becomes your security, because even if you have your own security for your own applications and data, still that cloud provider and what they're doing is important to you.
Certainly, and as more people in the government move into the cloud service providers, they're going to become a bigger target themselves.
Sure.
Because there's more value for the adversaries at that point for going after the cloud service provider. Then they can get all the federal agencies rather than just going after the federal agency themselves.
And Chad, you're shaking your head in vigorous agreement here.
There's a couple of things. One, the idea that you re-engineer your applications when you go to the cloud. I mean, that's one of the things I think a lot of us, we went with lift and shift, and lift and shift is, arguably, yeah, it'll get you to cloud, but it really doesn't get you the real benefits of it. So, as you engineer your applications to deal with the fact that everything in cloud is different than from hosting on-prem in terms of how you do network, how you do identity, all those things are different or can be different, especially as you move up the stack to platform or software as a service. Now you have an opportunity to engineer in the security, just like you have to engineer the changes in the rest of how the operating environment works. That's great. We haven't gotten there yet, but that's an area you want to go. The two other things that really, I think as a federal government, we need to get to is, as we go to more federal-wide cloud computing acquisition vehicles or environments, we need to build in monitoring up front. So if there's a government-wide software as a service vehicle for a certain type of service, then we ought to be working with the Department of Homeland Security to factor in and put CDM in there into that vehicle so that we're just consuming that service, not only the government-wide software as a service, but we're consuming the monitoring that's necessary. That's something we've got to factor in. The other piece we've got to figure out is the TIC overlay, right? The Trusted Internet Connection overlay. Either some of us are extending our boundaries into cloud infrastructure as a service, or we're sending our data through a TIC, which is incredibly inefficient. So we've got to figure out some sort of overlay to get from the cloud-provided service to those external customers without having to go back through our network and back through the tech. Those two areas need to be figured out if we're really going to get expansion of our core services into the cloud.
So really then you're saying that you have to have a technical strategy that's pretty detailed to back up your computing strategy, which, as which is still the policy of the government, cloud first. I don't think that's been rescinded or turned over or changed, and it makes sense. So is that a good way of putting it?
I think it's a good way of putting it, but again, it requires that we do things that are not natural to most federal agencies. We have to work together. It's not going to get better if we're, and I'm grateful to see that we've got these government-wide groups like the Cloud Center of Excellence that are trying to work on these things. We've got representation from pretty much all the CFO Act agencies, all the small agencies. So, there's 150 people working together within the government to try and drive those issues so that a small agency coming in doesn't have to figure it all out by themselves, and we can get the best of what DOJ is doing, the best of what DHS is doing, the best is what GSA is doing, and we're not all, we're not getting picked off by the vendors one by one. No offense to the vendors.
Peter?
Well, let me make this a little bit easier. When we talk about lift and shift, what we're talking about is taking one set of computing stuff and putting it in somebody else's environment. In that sense, and a lot of other senses, we're already in the cloud. Like the cloud is the internet. Like it's right there. The reason we call it a cloud is all of us in IT make diagrams, and they have computers indicated in them. And then there's a cloud. There's always a cloud, and it's somebody else's thing. What we really are doing is we're trusting that thing to take care of things that we would have had to do. So cloud really isn't that. Cloud is really about business processes, and it's about being able to do things that you couldn't do otherwise. For example, cloud allows me to do things like go to a website and say, I want to be able to build this and put in a credit card, and I can start at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday and be done on Monday morning at 6 and have something that works that's production ready. That is cloud. So don't worry about whether it's somebody else's computer or your computer in somebody else's environment. That's not important. What's important is what you can do with it. Another example is, and this is something we're doing today, it's possible to build hundreds of Hadoop nodes or Elasticsearch nodes in a cloud environment, in just about any cloud environment, in about 15 minutes with a couple of clicks, right? And these are the kinds of things that you can do in cloud. If you can't build something on demand, have it expand on demand and easily and quickly, and also contract, right? You're just not doing cloud. All you're doing is hosting your stuff someplace else. You're not getting any benefits from it.
All right, and Peter from RSA, Peter Tran, somebody's using cloud providers in a big way, because every week you read about another data center being built, and the country is dotted with thousands of windowless buildings. And so, again, I want to get maybe your view of some of the commercial best practices that could translate to the public sector in security architecture when you have hybrid or even all cloud environments.
So hybrid cloud is somewhere in between a boxing match and a game of tug of war. Just because in the last 10 years, this environment is very tactile. We get comfortable when we have our data centers, and we have a span port we can tap into, but there are no span ports anymore. They're software defined. Mm-hmm. So in the commercial space, and the biggest consumer is the government for that, and hundreds of applications are being migrated on a monthly basis for security. And that's the danger. So from a commercial best practices, we want to see defense in depth, but we want to see beyond defense in depth, where the provisioning of security monitoring occurs before they can get access to the data. So compute power is one thing, access data is to the other. But there's something that we have to be very careful of, is the difference between an SLA and SLO, a service letter objective. So the natural tug of war, the boxing match that occurs, is everybody wants to shift risk somewhere. The commercial side doesn't want to assume all the risk of their customers. Certainly the customer wants to be protected. Mm-hmm. So from a best practice standpoint, it's really defining what the SLO, SLA is going to provide you. Not what it says, what it's actually going to provide you, because that's called, theoretically, in reality, the Dead Sea effect. There's this portion in the middle that everybody knows is there, and they kind of push off risk. And that's where the attack surface starts to grow in the hybrid environment, where you said, well, I thought you were going to handle it. Well, no, you were going to handle it, and all of a sudden you have a material breach in your software-defined environment, and then you're not sure that you can perform the post-mortem forensic analysis of that because you don't have the data, and you don't know who's responsible for the data. So I think from the beginning that needs to be a conversation that occurs.
Yeah, so SLO comes before SLA.
Absolutely,
so that
operationally.
You have just basic understanding of what it is.
And IVNV too, independent validation and verification of the SLO before you lock it down as an SLA.
Interesting, okay. Does that ring true for the government people?
Absolutely. In fact, our Eagle 2 contract at DHS has an IVNV track. Mm-hmm. Just for these types of things, whether it's cloud, whether it's agile computing.
So you're there.
You're right. Yeah.
The way Peter
to come back in and make sure that, hey, are you really living up to the performance metrics and the objectives and goals that you had set from the beginning?
Okay, and as Peter Schellwacher mentioned, these diagrams with a cloud in the middle always have arrows to something, and that takes us to the endpoints, which is the opposite end of all of this. And not only have data center and cloud proliferation affected government, but so has endpoint proliferation, with mobile devices, usually more than one per user, and nobody's really given up, or very few people have given up the standard desktop, which is maybe better understood, but still not the safest thing in the world. So let's talk about endpoint protection and how that fits into the continuous monitoring strategy and architecture. Anyone want to? Chad, you want to tackle that one?
We start with the traditional tools where we've got some monitoring on that endpoint, but at some point, I think we're going to have to get a little bit smarter on forcing the conversation with our business partners around what we allow these things to do, right? Whitelisting has been a dirty word in our environments, and limiting the ability of what our users are allowed to do has been that conversation that the security officers and the CIOs are afraid to have. So we need to take that and translate that need into business language of, hey, for example, and it's not specifically about whitelisting, but when I talk about social security numbers and PII with people, I say, as a business user, you personally have access to our entire portfolio of Social Security numbers. How comfortable do you feel with that when this is the cost of you making a mistake and all of a sudden, you know, they go completely white and go, oh my God. In fact, I've had one of our senior actuaries come to me and say, hey, I know I have access, but I limit myself because I know I don't need that. So if we start to limit, it used to be we built things for functional needs and we forgot about the non-functional of security. We've got to build that non-functional in at the start, where that means, hey, this application can only do this, or this endpoint can only do this, and yep, you're limited, but guess what? You know, you're protected as well, and you're not going to be the one I'm hunting down because you were allowed to do something that you really didn't have a business need for.
So Chad, I wanted to make a comment to the endpoint, because more often than not, and this is across public and private sector, is that we perform our endpoint security in isolation most of the time. And when we're talking about the multiple dimensions of continuous monitoring, or in hybrid environments particularly, you have endpoint, you have network, you have cloud, you have mobile, you have app, and theoretically, as we move into IoT, and the federal government is moving, whether we like it or not, into multi-sensor data, working that way. And for the endpoint itself, done in isolation, is a very, very dangerous place to be, because even metrics-wise, on a daily basis, in the last 4 years, there's been 820,000 new variants of malware, rough and tough, hitting that. That's 300 million a year, 1.2 billion the last 4 years. My new math.
So
whatever.
everybody on Earth can have one.
Pretty much, for the most part, right? So then you look at the multiple dimensions of your new environment, the current environment, and you're like, how can I possibly just tackle the endpoint and think that's going to solve it? Because the endpoints are changing on a daily basis.
But we'll continue with that. Right now we need to take a short break. Our discussion is Advanced Cyber Monitoring, sponsored by Optiv and RSA, here on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM.